Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Grandmaster Knockout. In the left corner, the one, the only Carlsen. And his opponent, ladies and gentlemen, So. Tonight, one board, 64 squares, playing white. Carlsen, playing black. So, gentlemen, let the battle begin. Carlsen, pawn to e4. So, pawn to e5. Carlsen, knight to f3. So, knight to c6. Carlsen, bishop to c4. So, knight to f6. Carlsen, pawn to d3. So, bishop to c5. Carlsen, bishop to g5. So, pawn to h6. Carlsen, bishop to h4. So, pawn to d6. Carlsen, pawn to c3. So, pawn to a5. Carlsen, castle's kingside. So, castle's kingside. Carlsen, knight to bd2. So, bishop to a7. Carlsen, pawn to a4. So, pawn to g5. Carlsen, bishop to g3. So, king to g7. Carlsen, rook to a1. So, pawn to g4. Carlsen, knight to h4. So, knight to h5. Carlsen, knight to f1. So, queen to g5. Carlsen, knight to e3. So, bishop takes a 3. Carlsen, rook takes a 3. So, knight to f4. Carlsen, queen to e1. So, bishop to e6. Carlsen, pawn to f3. So, pawn to h5. Carlsen, bishop to b5. So, knight to a7. Carlsen, pawn to d4. So, pawn to f6. Carlsen, rook to d1. So, knight to egg6. Carlsen, rook to d2. So, rook to f7. Carlsen, king to h1. So, king to h7. Carlsen, pawn to d5. So, bishop to d7. Carlsen, bishop takes d7. So, rook takes d7. Carlsen, knight to f5. So, knight to e7. Carlsen, bishop to h4. So, queen to g6. Carlsen, knight to g3. So, queen to h6. Carlsen, pawn to c4. So, rook to f8. Carlsen, rook to b3. So, knight to fg6. Carlsen, knight to f1. So, knight takes h4. Carlsen, queen takes h4. So, pawn to f5. Carlsen, queen to e1. So, pawn takes a4. Carlsen, queen takes a4, check. So, knight to g6. Carlsen, pawn to g3. So, rook to df7. Carlsen, rook to f2. So, queen to c1. Carlsen, king to g2. So, rook takes f3. Carlsen, rook takes f3. So, pawn takes f3, check. Carlsen, rook takes f3. So, queen takes b2, check. Carlsen, king to h3. So, queen to d4. Carlsen, queen takes d4. So, pawn takes d4. Carlsen, rook takes f8. So, knight takes f8. Carlsen, king to g2. So, knight to d7. Carlsen, knight to d2. So, knight to e5. Carlsen, pawn to h3. So, king to g6. Carlsen, king to f2. So, king to g5. Carlsen, king to f1. So, king to f6. Carlsen, king to f2. So, knight to d3, check. Carlsen, king to a2. So, knight to b2. Carlsen, knight to b3. So, king to e5. Carlsen, knight takes a 5. So, king to e4. Carlsen, pawn to g4. So, pawn takes g4. Carlsen, pawn takes g4. So, pawn to d3, check. Carlsen, king to d2. So, pawn to b6. Carlsen, knight to b3. So, knight takes c4, check. Carlsen, king to c3. So, pawn to d2. Carlsen, king to c2. So, king takes d5. Carlsen, pawn to g5. So, king to e5. So, delivers the finishing blow. Carlsen is down. If you love this fight, smash that like button and subscribe. More legendary battles are coming your way. See you in the next one.